What's going on, guys? Dare here with Fantasy Football Advice, coming at you with another fantasy football video. Today, we are going over the top waiver ads that you should be considering as we head into week 4. Some positions are starting to thin out, like tight end. A lot of them, even the players you shouldn't start, are starting to be owned in all leagues. Meanwhile, there are other positions like wide receiver, where some talent is starting to develop unowned. Before we do get into those players though, stat of the day. Yesterday's stat of the day was which team allowed the most receptions through 2 weeks to the tight end position. The correct answer was actually the New Orleans Saints with 20 receptions. Congratulations to Jace, you got this one right. As for today's stat of the day, through 3 weeks, which quarterback currently leads the league in completed air yards? This is going to be more of an efficiency metric, so a quarterback who throws a lot of deep passes and has a lot of air yards may not be the best quarterback to pick. So think about it. If you think you know who it is, leave your answer in the comment section down below. We'll be happy to let you know who wins in tomorrow's video. Also, guys, with information developing every day, who we believe you should add, who you should trade for, and which players to start are going to change each and every day. If you want to be fully updated, consider signing up for our website, thefantasyfootballadvice.com. Members of our website get all the benefits, including top waiver ads, fab suggestions, access to our trade model, sports betting picks, DFS picks, and more. So if that interests you, once again, go to our website, thefantasyfootballadvice.com. Link, as always, in the description box below. With that out of the way though, we're going to jump into the running backs, arguably the most important position in all of fantasy. And to start, we are going over the high owned running backs. Leading this list, we have DeVonta Freeman, currently owned in about 60% of leagues. I know most competitive leagues he's really not available, but make sure you take a look. With Saquon Barkley out, we knew the signing of DeVonta Freeman meant that he was inevitably going to be the starter, considering he was brand new to the team and the other running backs on the roster, Wayne Gallman, Dion Lewis, had much more experience in the offense. We weren't expecting DeVonta Freeman to be very involved. It was very positive to see though that he did lead the team when it came to rush attempts out of the backfield. This game was also a blowout, so not the best showing for this backfield either, but it's a clear indication that DeVonta Freeman will be the guy. How valuable that actually will end up being, that's debatable, but anytime you have the potential to get a workhorse running back who's going to get plenty of volume, you have to go out and target them. So DeVonta Freeman, he leads this list. Behind him, we have Jerrick McKinnon, who is currently dealing with a rib injury. If the rib injury for McKinnon does leave him out, then Jeff Wilson will of course be a better player to add than Jerrick McKinnon. But no matter which running back in this backfield is healthy, McKinnon has already done enough to establish his own role. His role is mainly in the receiving game, which is one of the most valuable roles from the running back position. So there's no denying he should be owned in all leagues. Up next is Myles Gaskin, currently owned in 46% of leagues. He received a massive amount of volume, 27 overall touches. In PPR leagues, has not scored less than 10 PPR points in each of the first 3 games. And currently, there really is no threat to his role. Unfortunately though, last week's game script was heavily in his favor. There will be much worse ones for him moving forward, but regardless, he could be a spot start in a good matchup, and one injury to a player like Jordan Howard could increase the potential upside for Gaskin. The last high ownership running back would be Nyheim Hines. While Hines is not a player that we should consider starting, he did lead the team in targets. He is seeing plenty of field time, and in game scripts in which the Indianapolis Colts are trailing, we could see his involvement even increase further. For now, he's just an add to keep on the bench, a depth piece, maybe a flex start in a pinch. So if you see one of your league mates drop him for another hot name off the waivers, try to add him, leave him on the bench. As the season progresses, you may get something out of him. Moving over to the low ownership running backs, we have Carlos Hyde leading this list. If you were unaware, Chris Carson, he did suffer an injury. It was very late in the game though, so we didn't get a good idea of how much volume they were willing to give to Carlos Hyde behind him. What we do know though is that they are completely comfortable passing the ball out of the backfield to Carlos Hyde, which indicates they do see Carlos Hyde as a player that can fit the vacated role of Chris Carson while he is injured. Currently, the information on how long Carson will be out is limited. Even if we do have more information, Seattle's not one of those teams to completely release accurate information. Timetables for return, how serious the injury actually is, this is information we may not fully get, and if some is released, it may not be 100% accurate. Up next, we have Jeff Wilson Jr. As I stated earlier, Jerrick McKinnon, he did suffer a rib injury. Jeff Wilson was one of the primary running backs out of the backfield in this game. If there is no Jerrick McKinnon, this is going to increase the volume he gets. Jeff Wilson is also very versatile. The team uses him both rushing, receiving, and heavily on the goal line. So a player like that who is going to get an increased amount of volume, he's the type of player you could grab off the waiver wire and potentially start as early as next week. Moving on, we have Rex Burkhead of the New England Patriots. Putting him on this list is more a result of a very good game. He scored 2 times, taking over the vacated role of James White, and definitely looked good doing it. I'm not sure how many games we will have where we feel confident starting Rex Burkhead. If James White is back, that's going to reduce the amount of volume he gets in the receiving game. The rush attempts that a running back gets from this backfield changes each week, so although his strong performance does warrant an add, I'm really not convinced this is the type of player we're going to consider starting each week. The next 3 players we have are more of handcuffs. You could add Brian Hill to this list. He did have a good game. Although with Brian Hill, I don't think even if Gurley went down, there would be a lot of upside for him. Last season, when this team had virtually no competition out of the backfield, he didn't do enough to shine. And with the team being very pass friendly, there aren't a ton of opportunities for the rushers. As for Chase Edmonds though, this is definitely a pick-off talent. Anytime we see him touch the ball, he has actually looked better than Drake. The first thought for people are, if Kenyon Drake really doesn't have a lot of upside himself, why would I get the backup who could potentially be worse? And that's an understandable thought process, but you have to think if Kenyon Drake didn't have a talented running back like Chase Edmonds breathing down his neck, he would likely get more volume, more snaps, and that increased opportunity share would lead to better performances. If Kenyon Drake does go down with an injury and Chase Edmonds was the lead back out of this backfield, he would actually likely receive more touches than Kenyon Drake is currently getting, because the gap in talent when you compare Chase Edmonds and the player behind him on the depth chart, it's much greater than what we currently have of Kenyon Drake and Chase Edmonds. The next 2 players we have, Benny Snell, Anthony McFarland, 2 backups out of Pittsburgh. I believe these players should be owned in all leagues. We knew coming into this season, James Conner was going to be the man. In week 1 though, he suffered an injury, did not look as good as Benny Snell did, and the people that were against drafting James Conner, they were running victory laps. Well, since then, James Conner has become more healthy, been given the workload that we had expected heading into this season, and ultimately, he's been performing like an RB1. One thing we have to understand though is that James Conner is still a severe injury risk. I would not be surprised if even next game that he left and he was injured could potentially go on IR, and if that happens, Benny Snell or Anthony McFarland would ultimately end up being the starter. This position for this team is very, very valuable, and when you factor in that the percentage chance that James Conner actually finishes the season healthy is relatively low, it's a good bet to take for one bench spot that could potentially have the upside to be a league winner. We're moving over to wide receivers. We're starting with high ownership, and to lead we have Preston Williams of the Miami Dolphins. When it comes to Preston Williams, I doubt he's going to be a player we trust as anything more than a flex, as long as the remaining pieces in Miami are all healthy, that being Gesicki, DeVonta Parker, are likely going to be above him in the pecking order of volume. On the other hand, with DeVonta Parker already appearing on the injury report, there is a chance that he re-aggravates some of his injuries. If that ultimately ever left him out and he wasn't going to be the starter, Preston Williams would clearly be the next man up. More volume for a player like Preston Williams, who has proven to be very efficient, would instantly result in better fantasy production. So in a good matchup with no DeVonta Parker, I could easily see him in wide receiver 2 consideration. Moving on, we have Corey Davis of the Tennessee Titans. This could be more of a short-term rental, and to be clear, he is facing Pittsburgh followed by Buffalo. By that time, there's a possibility that AJ Brown returns and Corey Davis may no longer be the leading receiver from a volume perspective, so I'm not very high on this pick. I don't even know if I trust him as a starter, especially in those matchups, but his role, it does warrant an add. Lastly, we have N'Keal Harry, who is coming off of his worst performance of the season. The New England offense as a whole did struggle to move the ball downfield from a passing perspective, so we really can't hold that against him. But what we do know is that he has securely carved out a role in the passing game. Currently, it isn't a very valuable role, but that could improve as the season progresses. Cam Newton, new to the team. The odds are Cam Newton will improve from a passing perspective as the season goes on. And if that does hold true, N'Keal Harry stands to be one of the players benefiting the most. Moving over to the lower owned wide receivers, we're starting with Brandon Aiyuk. Jimmy Garoppolo was ruled out, leaving Nick Mullins as the starter. Garoppolo's injury is noted as a high ankle sprain, which for wide receivers and running backs does hold players out for a significant amount of time. Quarterbacks who aren't really relying on their mobility, they can come back a bit quicker, but in the meantime, Nick Mullins will remain the starter. As the starter, he looked very, very good. The most important thing, of course, was that he heavily targeted Brandon Aiyuk. Aiyuk finished the game with 8 targets, converted that into 5 receptions for 70 yards, and Kyle Shanahan found a way to get him even more involved with 3 rushes out of the backfield where he even scored a touchdown. It's a pretty safe bet to take that if Nick Mullins remains the starter and Brandon Aiyuk is on the field, these are the types of games we could expect consistently. Immediately, that would put him into flex consideration, and with his next 3 games being against Philadelphia, Miami, and the LA Rams, this could be a player you grab off the waivers and thrust into your lineup immediately. Behind him, we have Justin Jefferson of the Vikings, who arguably put up one of the best performances of week 3. He received 9 targets, which outpaced Adam Thielen by 4 targets, but more importantly, he made the most of it. He averaged 25 yards per reception, put up 175 yards, and even caught his first receiving touchdown in the NFL. This Minnesota Vikings team, historically, while Kirk Cousins being the starter, they have had a target funnel that benefited the wide receivers on this team, so it's very likely that now that Justin Jefferson has broken out, he will not only continue to get volume, but had also proved he may not be reliant on high volume in order to produce for fantasy. The next player we have is Allen Lazard of the Green Bay Packers. If you watch my wide receiver start and sit video, I did say that out of MVS and Allen Lazard, I thought Lazard would be the clear player to take over the role of Davante Adams if he was out, and that did hold true for week 3. This certainly could be a situation where we have one of those rare wide receiver handcuffs. The way that Aaron Rodgers is currently playing and the amount of value that's in that role in this offense, it does mean that Allen Lazard should be owned on all teams if Davante Adams is starting. It's unlikely you should trust Lazard in your starting lineup, but if Lazard does continue to produce with Aaron Rodgers, even if Davante Adams comes back, there's a possibility that the connection he has built garners him a target market share even with all the players on the field. The next player we have is Hunter Renfrow of the Las Vegas Raiders. Henry Ruggs, he was ruled out for week 3. Bryan Edwards, the rookie with a lot of upside, he also suffered an ankle injury. If they head into week 4 and beyond with a depleted wide receiver core as injured as it was this week, Hunter Renfrow could be a player with guaranteed volume. If Renfrow did not look as good as he did in week 3, then I wouldn't be recommending to pick him up and potentially consider starting him, but that's not the case. He did pass the eye test. The unfortunate part is that their next matchup is against Buffalo. Buffalo, a very tough defense against wide receivers, and there is a possibility that by week 5 and beyond, some of the pieces around him begin to get healthy, thus diminishing his overall role. The next player we have is Anthony Miller of the Chicago Bears. This is a player that in my own personal leagues I've seen been dropped and added by several teams. I've taken the stance on Anthony Miller that if I see him on the waivers, I do want him on my bench. Not that I would consider starting him unless it was a good matchup and some of my players were on bye, but he is certainly a player who could produce in a solid matchup. The volume for Miller, though, it really isn't there. He's been very efficient on the volume he's received, but with a season high of 6 targets in a game, he's the type of player to require a touchdown in order not to bust. Behind him, we have Alshon Jeffery, and I know that name sounds gross. Even since we saw him on the field last, he didn't produce, and anyone starting him was very disappointed with his production. But the fact of the matter is, the Philadelphia Eagles wide receiver core is completely depleted. Jalen Reagor, he tore a ligament in his thumb. Deshaun Jackson, he's now out with an injury. This leaves Greg Ward, JJ Arcega-Whiteside, and the 2 tight ends to pick up that production. Even if there is a 10% chance that Alshon Jeffery comes back and produces as a wide receiver 2 or better, that's a solid chance to take on a player that has some upside in an offense that could really use him. Lastly, we have Chase Claypool and James Washington. We could combine these 2 players together. The reason for our consideration to add them is because Deontay Johnson did suffer an injury in week 3. The injury is a concussion though, so we shouldn't expect him to be out for a significant amount of time. But if you're looking for a short-term rental, one of these 2 players could potentially have enough volume to produce in week 4. If you want to bank on the talent, I'd go with Chase Claypool, but the approach these Steelers have always taken has been to follow the depth chart, which up until this point has left James Washington as the next man up. Washington led the team in targets last week, and although he hasn't proven it yet, he is a superior deep threat. That's gonna do it for wide receivers though. We're moving over to tight ends. Usually we start with the high ownership tight ends, which last week included Dallas Goedert, Jonnu Smith, who both were around 60% owned. This week, the only player in the 60 to 40% owned range is Austin Hooper, who I would not recommend you guys pick up. So we'll move right into the lower percent owned tight ends. To lead this list, out of Dallas, we have Dalton Schultz. Schultz provided a modest performance against Seattle. He posted 4 receptions for 48 yards on 6 targets. While that may have disappointed anyone who started him, you had to understand that Seattle was not a good team to start your tight end against. You had to bet on the high over under on this one, and since he didn't score, he didn't hit the high end of his range of outcomes. Looking past what he was able to do this week, we have seen enough to prove that he will be a main contributor in this offense. Since we know this offense will have plenty of scoring opportunities throughout the season, one of the best offenses in the league, it's the perfect situation for a tight end in a position that is usually TD or bust. Behind him, we have Logan Thomas of the Washington football team, who so far this season has averaged 8 targets per game. Unfortunately, Dwayne Haskins is not the most accurate quarterback. Logan Thomas had to make a spectacular diving catch to get one of his receptions this week, but when it comes to tight ends and involvement in their offense, it's hard to find one more involved than Logan Thomas. If we see improvement from Dwayne Haskins down the stretch, Logan Thomas will remain to be involved, and that role will be even more valuable. But even without that, Logan Thomas remains a high floor option. Up next is Drew Sample of the Cincinnati Bengals. He finished week 3 with 1 target, 1 reception, and 1 receiving yard. So if you're results oriented, Drew Sample may be off your list. We do have to, however, value the role that he's currently filling for CJ Uzomah, which is a matchup based role that could be a spot start. We knew heading into this matchup we couldn't expect the same volume he had in week 2 where Joe Burrow threw for 61 attempts, but regardless, this was a disappointing performance, and we definitely have better performances coming in the future. Behind him, we have Mo Alie-Cox of the Indianapolis Colts. He is on an offense led by Phillip Rivers, who historically has heavily targeted the tight end position. The competition for targets within his position, it's going to increase. We have Jack Doyle, who was injured this week. Although he did play, we know that the snaps and opportunities for Mo Alie-Cox did increase because of that injury, which means there is a chance that some of his overall opportunities may decrease from this point forward. What he has done though while on the field has been more than enough to warrant an ad, and the health of Jack Doyle is all but guaranteed. So for that reason, if you're desperate for a tight end, consider Mo Alie-Cox. The final 2 tight ends I don't really have much faith in, but to start we have Jimmy Graham. Jimmy Graham received 7 targets in week 1, 9 targets in week 3, and has now had 3 receiving touchdowns so far this year. We have seen the low end of his production though in week 2, where he only had 1 target, resulting in 1 reception for 18 yards, which means this is the type of player to have a very low floor, but potentially a high ceiling. The Chicago Bears are not going to be facing weak passing defenses like Atlanta each and every week, so adding him and expecting him to be an every week producer is pretty pretty much out of the question, but if you want to add him, see if his boom games are much more frequent than his bust games, then I can't argue with that strategy. The final player we have is Eric Ebron of the Pittsburgh Steelers, and so far what we've seen from him this season has been that his volume has increased each and every week. If that is a trend as opposed to an outlier, then Eric Ebron could be a player that starts to become fantasy relevant. With the injury to Deontay Johnson, who is probably not going to play next week because he's going to be in concussion protocol, this could increase the overall opportunities for Ebron, meaning if he does produce, the chances of him actually becoming more involved will increase as well. If you're adding him though, I wouldn't necessarily try to get him in the lineup. There are just too many good options, but a speculative add on a receiver who could improve and get more volume. If your bench is really weak or depleted, maybe that's the route you want to take. But guys, that's gonna do it for this video. We really hoped you enjoyed. If you did, how about hitting that like button? If you're new to the channel, please hit that subscribe button. We thank you all for watching, and we'll catch you on the next one.